have in Halloween then is an absorption again into Christianity of various harvest festivals at the end of the harvest season, folkish pagan rituals associated with the oncoming of the dark period of the year. As the days grow shorter, the nights go longer, and all of the primordial associations that there are of light and dark. And then, there are various traditions then that are associated with the celebration of All Hallows Day, which will fall on Tuesday, November 1st, and then All Souls Day the day after, and this suspicion that the spirits of the dead roam the earth, which allows you to then have this anarchic celebration of ghoulishness that takes place on Halloween, very similar to the kind of anarchic celebration that takes place on Mardi Gras before the season of Lent begins in the springtime. And it was very popular for people to put on little medieval mummer plays, which is where we get dressing up from. But most of the traditions that we associate with Halloween in the United States are actually Scottish and Irish traditions that are absorbed into American culture in the late 19th and early 20th century with big waves of Scottish and Irish immigrants. It's largely not a continental European festival, in the same way that you have certain aspects of the Day of the Dead and things like that in Latin culture, but it's largely Scottish and Irish folkish elements that we absorb into Halloween today. Ironically enough, when I grew up, Halloween was not a thing in England. I think it is probably now, and I think that's part of the kind of Americanization of global culture, the exporting of dressing up and games and candy, but that was not a thing in England. November the 5th is the big festival around this time, which is Guy Fawkes Night, which is a very, very religious festival in England, where we celebrate the hanging, drawing, quartering, and burning of Guy Fawkes, Guy de Fawkes, an evil man who collaborated with the Spanish and tried to blow up Parliament in 1605. While King James I would have been visiting Parliament. James I, incidentally, a man very, very interested in demons and devils. He actually wrote a little booklet on demons and devils, and it's thought that Shakespeare, to play a compliment to the new king, who acceded to the throne after Elizabeth I in 1603, wrote Macbeth, a play about a Scottish king and demons and demonology, as a tribute to James I, who was kind of obsessed with this whole topic. Anyway, so much for Halloween. Let's talk a little bit about Satan and the devil. If you look up the references to Satan and the devil in the Hebrew scriptures, you will find very, very few references indeed, probably no more than 20. And there's really no concept of the devil. The devil is a word that we find in the Christian scriptures in the New Testament. It's a Greek word, diabolos, but it's derived from its Hebraic origin, which is Satan or Ha-Satan, and Satan in Hebrew means the accuser, or the slanderer, or sometimes it could just mean the adversary. This is the figure you see at the beginning of the book of Job, who seems to be some sort of member of the heavenly court. He's described as a son of God, and his function seems to be to act as a kind of prosecuting attorney in heaven regarding the righteousness or virtue of human beings before God. But if you go back further into the Jewish scriptures, into the earliest texts we have in Judaism, there doesn't seem to be a separate force of evil that is counterposed to God. Good and evil in early Judaism seem to emanate from the same source, and that is God. God is the source of blessing, of prosperity, with immense creative power, but God is also capable of enormous destructive power and of wreaking punitive havoc in the world. We see this particularly with the flood story, where God in anger reduces the world he has created to a state of pre-creation chaos by drowning it all in a flood, which, although it gets rid of all the wicked people, there must have been a huge amount of collateral damage, in such a destruction. We see this in the God who also wreaks havoc on the Egyptians with the plagues during the Exodus story. We see this in the God who seems to be totally okay and totally down with the Jews practicing an ethnic cleansing, genocidal policy in the book of Joshua and Judges as they re-enter and take the promised land, and in the process slaughter tens of thousands of non-Jewish Canaanites who are living in the promised land, men, women, and children, and presumably, of course, pregnant women as well, which would make God an abortionist, which is very inconvenient for some people. So, this idea then in early Judaism is that, God has a good side and a dark side. He has a light side, but he also has a shadow side. There's a sort of alter ego to God, which can manifest itself in, what we would regard as evil. I mean, there is a verse at the end of Job where it reflects on the fact that God has been the source of all the evil that takes place in Job's life. It's a very inconvenient truth that we don't like to think about. And it seems what happens in Judaism then over time is that dark side of God, the kind of Darth Vader side of God. He could be good, he could become like Luke Skywalker if he sticks with the Force, but if he gives into his dark impulses, he becomes a Sith Lord. That thinking in Judaism seems to be one that eventually diverges so that a counterweight emerges to God, which is an opponent or an adversary of God, a manifestation, a personal manifestation of the forces of evil. And that's the form of the devil that we're perhaps a little bit more familiar with, not from Judaism, but from the New Testament. You can see this in the Hebrew scriptures, in the story of David. One of the wicked things that David does, right up there with killing another man and sleeping with his wife, David also holds a census. See, the Tea Party would have hated David. David has a census, so we all really know that the reason for census is for tax purposes. And God is mad at David, and all sorts of terrible things happen to David because of this census. Now, in the first telling of this story in the book of Samuel, David has the census because he's clearly driven by worldly, financial incentives. When the story is told a couple of hundred years later, the story of the census in the book of Chronicles, a retelling of that story, has Satan enter into David. So David is not acting simply on personal, selfish impulses. There's actually some evil, malevolent spirit that's been entering into David. You see this also with the story of Saul. When God gets pissed off with Saul, God inflicts an evil spirit on Saul, and it drives him mad. But God is the source of that evil spirit in the earlier version of Samuel. Once we get to Chronicles, retelling those stories again, it's a separate force that is compelling and pushing forward these forms of behavior. Now, what really sets the scene for us then in terms of the stories of demons and the devil that we get in the Christian scriptures, particularly in the Gospels, is a movement in Jewish history called apocalypticism. And I want to take a little bit of time to talk about apocalypticism this morning. When we hear the word apocalypse or apocalypticism, we immediately think of what? The end of the world, right? Everyone immediately jumps to the end of the world. Now, there is an element to the idea of the end of the world and apocalypticism, but that's not predominantly what it's about. Apocalypticism comes from a Greek word, apokalypsis, which means revelation or unveiling. And that's actually the name of the last book in the Christian scriptures. It's called the Apocalypsis in Greek, the revelations that are received by John on Patmos. Now, for a long time in Jewish history, the Jews believed that their relationship with God is governed by the covenant, which is a reciprocal agreement between God and human beings that kind of creates instant karma. If you worship the one true God and you keep his commandments, you love God and you love your neighbor as yourself, you will be blessed and you will prosper. It's an idea that's very, very popular in many strands of evangelicalism today. The idea you might have heard of the prosperity gospel. Creates a very unpleasant incentive that the only reason you want to be a good person is because you're going to get lots of stuff. that idea works for about a millennium in Judaism until it stops working. On a hypothesis, it's only as good as the data that it explains. And after the Jewish state of the northern kingdom of Israel is conquered by the Assyrians, and then the southern state of Judah is conquered by the Babylonians, and Jerusalem is destroyed, and the Ark of the Covenant disappears, and the elites are carried into exile in Babylon. This all happens around the 7th or 6th century BCE. And then the Persians conquer the Babylonians, and then the Greeks conquer the Persians, and then the Romans conquer the Greeks. And then after you have centuries and centuries of foreign conquest, and the connection between the Jews and their autonomous control of the Promised Land is lost for generations and generations, that idea of covenant becomes rather disenchanting. Because it looks like God is not holding up his bargain of the covenant. In the past, there is sin, there are consequences, then there is repentance, and then there is restoration. But no restoration seems to be happening in this long period. I'm talking about the 600s, the 500s, the 400s, the 300s BCE. Good people are suffering, and wicked people are prospering. Idolatrous foreign empires are thriving at the expense of God's chosen people, who certainly have been punished, but how much do they need to be punished? For generations and generations and generations must they suffer because of the sins of their forebears? And so a dissatisfaction emerges with this idea of the covenant theory of history. And this is when new ideas begin to emerge. And they're referred to in the texts as apocalypses. New revelations are received by the prophets and the sages. Apocalypsis, or the language of Revelation, indicates then that things are hidden from us. And this is a common idea in Judaism. God ultimately is hidden from us. God is not a created being. He's not an animal. He's not an aspect of nature. He's not anthropomorphic. He doesn't look like us. He's not available to our sense perceptions. He's a transcendent supernatural being. So any ability that we have to know or understand or experience God must be dependent on God's willingness to unveil or reveal or disclose himself in ways that are appropriate to human understanding. And he does this in various ways throughout the Jewish scriptures. The first verb we have associated with God in Judaism is, in the beginning, God created. Yeah, the first thing we learn about God, the first unveiling of God, is his creative power. Now, we know as well that he can use that power for destructive ends, but predominantly, God uses his power responsibly to create a good environment in which human beings can thrive in relationship with him and with each other. We see God drawing close to people in a covenantal relationship, which is amazing, a kind of an agreement, a negotiation of equals that almost takes place between him and Abraham in order to establish mutually beneficial relations in the future. We see God again revealed in the deliverance of his people in the Exodus story. You'll find the Jewish writers in the Hebrew scriptures constantly referring to the God who brought our forefathers out of Egypt. Who is God? God is what God has done. He has covenanted with us. He has created the world. He has delivered us from evil. Of course, he then gives these very detailed rules and laws in Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy that allows the Jews to know exactly what their obligations are under the covenant. All 613 subsections and subparagraphs. Those are the number of, there's not 10 commandments. 10 commandments are the spark notes. They're the spark notes of the spark notes. There's 613 things you can and predominantly can't do in the Torah. But for the Jews, that's a great blessing. That's all the details in the owner's manual of their relationship with God so that they can live life properly and fully. And then when the Jews sin and fall away from their covenantal responsibilities, God sends the prophets who are spokespersons, messengers, literally people who speak for God and again reveal God's will and God's word in specific historical circumstances. So there's always this tension within Judaism between what's hidden about God and what God is revealing to his people in their relationship together through history. And so apocalypticism then emerges as a further extension of that process of unveiling in the relationship between God and humanity humanity's understanding of God. because they don't seem to be understanding God properly if God is inflicting centuries of foreign domination on them for so-called sins of their forefathers. God doesn't seem to be interested in justice anymore, or God isn't keeping up his side of the bargain. So, new unveilings or new revelations take place, and this is what we collectively call apocalypticism. What new revelations or unveilings take place in the Jewish literature of the second half of the millennium BCE? Well, first of all, we discover there is an afterlife. There's no afterlife for the majority of Hebrew scripture history. When you die, you go into a pit called Sheol, and that's it. Hopefully you were a good person and people remember the good things about you. That's the extent to which you have immortality in Judaism. But as we clearly see hinted at in Ezekiel, in the story of the resurrection of the dry bones, but then you see explicitly in the book of Daniel, which is written in the 2nd century of BCE, which is the most graphic and detailed apocalyptic text in the Hebrew scriptures, there is books of life where God has written everybody's names, and when people die, they will come back to life, and the wicked will be punished, and the good will be rewarded. So look, the afterlife is a way in which you can preserve God's justice. It's just not necessarily going to be instantaneous in this life, but ultimately in the afterlife, God will ensure that the good get their reward and the bad get what's coming to them too. How do you get to the afterlife in Judaism, in apocalyptic Judaism? You get there through the resurrection of the body. They don't have this Greek idea of transmigration of souls. That's not a Jewish or apocalyptic, or for that matter, a Christian idea. Your body is somehow physically reconstituted in a way that it now has an eternal reality that is then subject to judgment by God and appropriate reward or punishment, presumably based on your adherence to the Torah. So there's an entirely new unveiling of God's purposes in history and outside of history that are able then to rescue the righteousness and justice of God from what seems like injustice and a lack of righteousness in history itself. And part of these apocalypses, part of these revelations then, is the idea that there is going to be a Mashiach. Mashiach, a Messiah in Hebrew, means the anointed one. It's the title that the Jews gave for their kings. When Saul and David become kings of Israel, Samuel the prophet goes out and he anoints them, which is a ceremony of pouring of oil on their head, which is a kind of household ritual at that time when a guest would come to your house in the Middle East and they're hot and they're dusty and they're dirty, and as a good host you would bring out water and you would wash their hands and their face and their neck and their feet, and then finally you would pour oil on their head. You will anoint their heads. Because it's basically product. You're getting all the grime and the knots and the stuff out of your hair. And now you're nice and respectable. You've gone to the powder room. Now you can sit down and have dinner as a guest. So the anointing of the kings of Israel it's like God is the owner of the house of Israel, the land of Canaan. And he's welcoming the king as his guest. God was totally opposed to this idea of kingship, remember. He thought it was a terrible idea because human beings will trust the king rather than God, and the kings will become greedy and corrupted by power rather than being able to wield power justly like God does. But anyway, God is saying to the kings, here, you are guest in my land, but you are bound by my rules. I have anointed you as my guest, but if you break the rules, you're out. And the kings are studies in the vulnerability and frailty of the human relationship with power, as you read through those stories in the book of Samuel and the book of Kings. The kings don't live up to those expectations, and that's part of the reasons why the kingdoms fall into foreign control. But the apocalypticists hope that God is eventually going to send a pristine king, a Mashiach. It's not sure if it's an earthly being that's been raised up to that level, or whether it's actually a heavenly being who comes down onto earth, who's going to sort out this entire mess of a lack of justice. Because although we're postponing justice to the afterlife, that must be intolerable to God overall. God wants justice now on the earth. Why is there no justice now on the earth? Well, there must be someone who is frustrating or meddling with God's purposes. And so in apocalypticism, that idea of Satan as the adversary begins to emerge as a countervailing force against the divine will. Just as God wishes for there to be righteousness and justice and fairness in the universe, there are other forces at work in the universe that seek to thwart God's will. This is what Satan means. It means the adversary, the one opposed to God. Whatever God wants, Satan opposes. Whatever Satan wants, God opposes. And therefore, what it looks like to apocalypticists then is that God has temporarily lost control of the world because it's now under the dominion of Satan. And therefore, apocalypticists look and find manifestations of this evil power all over the place. They see it politically, in terms of the regimes that have controlled and colonized Israel, but they also see it on a personal level as well, in terms of manifestations of evil behavior and evil action and flirtation with evil practices like idolatry and paganism. And by the time we get to the time of Jesus then, just as there are angelic forces that can support and propel you towards righteousness and goodness, there are also countervailing demonic forces that, if you are sinful, can enter into you and control you and take you over. You know, like you're a piece of machinery and they grab hold of the steering wheel and now you belong to them, just as now the promised land that God had given to the Jews belongs to the Romans or the Greeks or the Persians. So, by the time we get to the time of Jesus, there are many different types of apocalyptic writing out there in Judaism. And we have examples of those apocalyptic texts in the Christian scriptures. Jesus preaches a couple of apocalyptic sermons that you can find in Mark 13, Luke 21, Matthew 23 and 24. The earliest book in the Christian scriptures in the New Testament is Paul's first letter to the Thessalonians, written probably in the late 40s, which is thoroughly apocalyptic, particularly chapter 3 and 4. And of course, the Bible ends with this very detailed, complex work of apocalypticism in the book of Revelation. So Jesus, whoever Jesus, the historical Jesus of Nazareth was, he seems to be an apocalyptic Jew. Whoever Paul of Tarsus was, he seems to also have been an apocalyptic Jew. And apocalyptic Judaism fuses with and takes and exerts an enormous influence on the development of early Christianity. And so when you're reading the gospel text, you're seeing the world through the lenses, through the perspective of these apocalyptic Christians. And that's why you see on almost every page of the earliest gospel, Mark's gospel, you see these literal battles between the power of God and the power of Satan, between light and dark, between good and evil, between angels and demons, between heaven and hell, between God and Satan. There is no middle ground in apocalypticism. There are no fences. There are no yellow lines in the middle of the road. You are either on one side or you are on the other side. And so that dualism then, that very polarizing view of reality that you find in the Gospels is very indicative of apocalypticism. Apocalypticists also tend to be rather pessimistic, very pessimistic about the present, because the present is under the control of Satan. And at the time of Jesus, Satan is most manifest in the form of the Roman emperor. He is literally, if you want to coin a phrase, the Antichrist. He is opposed to the reign of Jesus. The reign of Jesus is set up, particularly in Mark's Gospel, as a counterfactual to the reign of Caesar. Whatever the reign of Caesar represents, Jesus is the opposite. And whatever Jesus stands for in the kingdom of God, the kingdoms of this world ruled over by Caesar are the opposite of that. And Caesar has his minions all over the place. He has Pilate, and he has various officials. And of course, most powerfully for Jews, he has the Roman army. And for an apocalyptic Jew at the time of Jesus, the Roman army are literally demons. They are minions of Satan controlling the promised land and pushing forward the agenda of evil. So they're pessimistic about the present because there are no human solutions, because these are supernatural problems. But they are hopeful that when the Messiah comes, there will be vindication. Now, vindication may come in the afterlife if we don't get justice now, but we are hoping that eventually God will send his champion, like David fighting Goliath. The Messiah will come and will fight the forces of evil. And there will be a great cosmic battle, and the devil and his demons will be defeated, and God and his Messiah and those who are righteous will be vindicated and rewarded. You know, the flip side of vindication is vengefulness. Apocalypticists almost get as excited about vengefulness as they do about their own vindication. There's something very bloodthirsty about apocalypticists in that sense. But apocalypticists always believe that they themselves are living in these end times, that all these things are going to take place imminently. The arrival of the Messiah, the great cosmic battle, things are getting about as bad as they can get, so God has to intervene and fix history. The author of the book of Daniel, writing in the 2nd century BCE, believed that he was living in the end times. Jesus, when he preaches his apocalyptic sermons in the Gospels, seems to indicate that he thinks these things are going to happen soon, if not in his lifetime, in the lifetime of his disciples or the next generation. Paul seems to think this too. And throughout history, every apocalypticist believes they are in the end times. My brother is a Seventh-day Adventist minister, and that's a whole separate story about how he's a Seventh-day Adventist minister, but it involves Jimmy Swagger and a motel room in Texas. But my brother is a Seventh-day Adventist, and Seventh-day Adventists are obsessed with apocalypticism. They're a 19th century cult that emerged in Christianity when they actually went back into the back of Daniel and they did the math and they carried the 3 and they added the cubits and they subtracted the millennia, and they got this date in 1843 when Jesus was going to come back. And they all gathered in a field in Tennessee, and Jesus didn't show up. And so they went back and redid the math, and they were off a year. So they came back in 1844, and Jesus didn't come back again. You know, they have this wonderful understatement in their history where they call this the Great Disappointment. Oh yeah. It's amazing how like an actual denomination of Christianity survives an inauspicious beginning like that. But look, my brother is obsessed with reading all these apocalyptic texts and figuring out when this is happening. And I've kind of like as his brother, you know, we avoid religion and politics in my family. But you know, I've read various Seventh-day Adventist texts, and in the 19th century, the Seventh-day Adventists think, you know, the Antichrist is, you know, England, you know, and in the 1920s they think the Antichrist is Nazi Germany, you know, in the 1950s they think the Antichrist is the Soviet Union, and then, you know, then they thought in the early 2000s the Antichrist was Osama bin Laden, but then when Osama bin Laden was shot, you know, you had to rewrite all those books again, you know, you'll always believe that you're living in the end times. These guys don't buy green bananas, right? So there are one thing that's terrifying and one thing that's reassuring about apocalypticists. Okay, the terrifying thing is they think they're living in the end times, so that gives them no incentive whatsoever to make the world better. They are very pessimistic about how things are, and it's only when things get as bad as they can get that the Messiah will come. So let's let the polar ice caps melt, let's let the polar bears die, you know, let's not find a solution to peace in the Middle East, you know, let's let everything go to rack and ruin, and when the last tree is cut down, Jesus comes back. The reassuring thing about apocalypticists is, so far, they've all been wrong. Martin Luther King, it's the 499th anniversary of the Reformation tomorrow. Martin Luther was once asked, what would you do if you knew that the world was going to end tomorrow? And he said, I would plant a tree. I'm with Luther. Okay, you must have hope for the future. And if you read the book of Revelation really is a manifesto of hope in times of terrible persecution in early Christianity, which would push everyone to despair. And apocalypticists often allow their enthusiasm for destruction and apocalypse to override their convictions of hope and belief in the future of God's kingdom on earth. Anyway, that's another matter. I want to just finish up by talking a little bit then about how apocalypticism is a lens then through which we ought to look at the texts in the Christian Gospels about devils and demons. So you find on almost every page of the Gospels Jesus performing exorcisms. Now, my students, some of my students have seen The Exorcist. I don't think I've ever seen The Exorcist. I don't really go for horror movies. It's not my thing. I actually work with an organization for 9 months that worked with victims of torture who are seeking refugee status in America, and that kind of cured me of any prurient interest in torture and violence against other human beings. But on almost every page of the Gospels, you have these stories of exorcisms, and I just want to show you, just very briefly, what a biblical idea of an exorcism actually looks like. So this is from the Lord of the Rings movie. This is the Two Towers, and this is a king called Theoden, who's clearly the king of England. Just because he said that, he is. And he has been possessed by an evil spirit unleashed on him by the evil wizard Saruman. So Saruman is controlling Theoden, and it's manifest then by his appearance. He looks old, he kind of speaks with a scary voice, and sometimes out of his mouth comes the voice of Saruman itself. So how are we going to deal with this evil spirit, this evil force that has taken control of Theoden, who's been driven into despair and given up on his kingdom, and therefore his whole kingdom is dying because he's dying? You have to countervail it then with the powerful forces of light that are represented by Gandalf. And what you see here then is pretty much a straightforward biblical exorcism.
My lord, Gandalf the Grey is coming.
Courtesy of your hall is somewhat lessened of late. Theoden King.
He's not welcome.
Why should I welcome you, Gandalf Stormcrow?
A just question, my liege. Late is the hour in which this conjurer chooses to appear. Last spell I did. Ill news, ill guess.
Be silent. Keep your forward tongue behind your teeth. I am a pass who found death to barely create words with a witless woman.
Stop. I told you to take with that star.
Theoden! Son of Finger!
Too long you've sat in the shadows.
I would stay still if I were you. Up to me.
I release you from the spell.
You have no power here, Gandalf the Grey.
I will draw you, Saruman, as poison is drawn from a wound. If I go, Theoden dies.
You did not kill me. You will not kill him.
Rohan was mine. Be gone. free air again.
Dark have been my dreams of late.
Fingers would remember their own strength better if they grasped your soul.
Okay, I love that clip for all sorts of reasons, but because it illustrates how, and Tolkien really understands this as an expert on ancient and medieval literature, it illustrates the way in which the demonic has a profoundly cultural and political dimension to it. You know, here is a battle for a monarch between the forces of evil and the forces of good. And it literally is Jesus arm wrestling Satan, right? You know, it is Gandalf's power as the power of light pitched against Saruman as the power of evil. And they are literally arm wrestling for the soul of Theoden. And when Saruman is cast out, when the demonic is removed from him, he realizes, you know, that all of that age and that disease and that sickness disappears from him. His voice regains its control. He takes control of himself. And, of course, then he has to realize that he is a political figure who ought to be wielding his sword in the fight, you know, of the forces of good in Middle-earth against the forces of evil. You know, and that's very much, you know, what much of the language of the demonic in the Gospels has to do with. Now, that's not to say that there aren't all sorts of ethical and moral dimensions to the demonic at the time of Jesus. Most Jews at the time of Jesus would believe that if you are an evil person, if you are doing what is sinful, then, or you are engaging in unclean practices or thoughts, then you are giving access points to the forces of evil, and they can enter and possess you. And only a power that is greater than that evil can relieve you then of the power of the devil. And we see this very clear in Mark chapter 3, where Jesus returns to his hometown of Nazareth. And the scribes who came down from Jerusalem said, "He has Beelzebul and the ruler of demons in him, and he cast out demons by Beelzebul." Beelzebul is a devil that lives on top of a trash heap outside of Jerusalem. There is this huge big trash heap to the south of Jerusalem in the valley of Hinnom, just on the side of Mount Zion, and all the organic trash would be burned there. And if you're a Jew at that time, looking out to the south, and see the valley of Hinnom with all this trash burning, that's your vision of hell. And there is a devil that lives on top of that trash pile, and he's called Beelzebul. He's the lord of the flies, because this place is infested with flies. So they're saying Jesus is casting out demons, but he's doing it by the power of Beelzebul. Now look, they are conceding something here about Jesus. They're conceding that Jesus has a supernatural power. They're just arguing about the source. And so Jesus schools them. He called to them and spoke to them in parables. How can Satan cast out Satan? If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. See, he quotes Abraham Lincoln. And if his house is divided against itself, that house will not be able to stand. If Satan has risen up against himself and is divided, he cannot stand, but his end has come. For no one can enter a strong man's house and plunder his property without first tying up the strong man. Then indeed the house can be plundered. Jesus is saying, okay, you say I'm working with Satan. Well, then I would be stuffing demons inside of people. But what kind of nonsensical military strategy does Satan have if Satan is taking out his fighters? That makes no sense. You concede I have power over the demons. The only logical explanation is then I must be on the side of God. And the power of God in this circumstances is stronger than the power of Satan. I want to finish up then by looking at perhaps what is the most detailed account of an exorcism in the Gospels, which hopefully will tie into some of these themes of apocalypticism that we've been talking about. And you know, there are many people who look back now at the manifestations of demonic possession in the ancient world, and they see this as psychosis, or they see this as mental health issues, or they see this as schizophrenia, or they see it as what's the word I'm thinking of? Epilepsy, and seizures. The symptoms that we get described in the sources very much look like those phenomenon that, of course, people in the ancient world who know nothing about brain science and neurochemistry understand at all. They know nothing about psychology. There are even arguments made that in a society like the one that Jesus lives in, where the Roman occupation was so brutal and so savage, where you would see crucifixions at every intersection and daily violence. Imagine what it's like to live in Mosul right now, as the ISIS regime is collapsing, and we hear these stories of mass executions and panic. This is a society that has almost collective PTSD. Which perhaps manifests itself at times then in behavior that they attribute to the demonic. But the most famous and the most detailed story we get of an exorcism is in Mark 5. They came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. And when he had stepped out of the boat, immediately a man out of the tombs with an unclean spirit met him. He lived among the tombs, and no one could restrain him anymore, even with a chain. For he had often been restrained with shackles and chains, but the chains he wrenched apart, and the shackles he broke in pieces, and no one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always howling and bruising himself with stones. So Jesus has gone across the Sea of Galilee. He's entered into Gentile territory, foreign land. There's a man there in Gerasa who has many, many demons in him. He has a terrible profile on Match.com. He likes to hang out in graveyards, he likes to break chains and howl and smash himself. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and bowed down before him, and he shouted at the top of his voice, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" It's a Greek construction there, Son of the Most High God. The Most High God is Zeus. "I adjure you by God, do not torment me." For he had said to him, Mark's grammar is very bad because Jesus is actually speaking to the man before that previous sentence. For Jesus had said to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." Then Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" He replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." He begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now there on the hillside a great herd of swine was feeding, and the unclean spirits begged him, saying, "Send us into the swine, let us enter them." So he gave them permission. And the unclean spirits came out and entered the swine, and the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and were drowned in the sea. Okay, now, I want you to hear this story as Mark's audience would hear it around about 70 CE, just about the time when the Romans are about to demolish the temple in Jerusalem and put down savagely a zealot-inspired rebellion, by basically Jewish jihadis who have tried to kick the Romans out, and the Romans have brought in massive numbers of legions under Vespasian and then under Titus that are going to scorch the earth, slaughter hundreds of thousands of Jews, and raze Jerusalem and the temple to the ground. You get this story where Jesus is talking about things that are foreign, going into Gentile territory. There are pigs there that you don't find amongst Jews. So this is all taking place amongst foreigners. And this man hangs out in a very unclean place for Jews, which is the cemetery. But he has enormous strength. People try to tie him up, which reminds you of that parable that Jesus told earlier about, look, if you want to rob someone's house, you have to tie up the strong man. Jesus' hot tips about burglarizing. And so this man, though, cannot be bound. He is tied up with shackles and irons, and he breaks them. He has immense strength. And he recognizes who Jesus is. He knows who his enemy is. No one in Mark knows who Jesus is except unclean spirits. The disciples never get it. Jesus' family never gets it. Peter is called Satan by Jesus because he doesn't get it. The Pharisees don't get it. The lawyers don't get it. The priests don't get it. Only the evil spirits get it. And this man recognizes who Jesus is, although he expresses it in Gentile terms. And Jesus then casts the demons out of him, and he says, my name is Legion because we are many. There are so many devils inside of me, it is like a Roman army. There's about 4,000 to 6,000 Roman soldiers in a legion. And what does Jesus do then? He then gives them permission to enter into a pigs and drowns. Now, 2 stories from the Jewish historian Josephus, who was writing in the 1st century. During the time of Jesus, there was an uprising in this area of Gerasa by Jewish zealots, by Jewish freedom fighters against the Romans. And they took nobles who had collaborated with the Romans in this area, and they killed them, and they dumped their bodies in the Sea of Galilee. Fast forward 40 years to the time that Mark is writing, around the year 70. Vespasian sends his legions up into this area as well to fight against the Jewish rebels. And probably knowing of that story from 40 years earlier, his legion goes into Gerasa, slaughters all of the Jewish rebels, and dumps their bodies in the Sea of Galilee. And then you realize, as you read the Greek, that there are all these military pieces of terminology in this text. Jesus issues a command. He gives an order. He gives them leave. He tells them to depart, like a general would tell soldiers to go to a certain place. The herd of pigs is actually, the word in Greek can mean cohort of soldiers. Jesus gives the order for them to depart, and they rush down the hill. In Greek, the word is charge. And then you realize what's going on here. This is an apocalyptic wish fulfillment, where Jesus is fighting the Roman army. And he's taking the Roman army, he's extracting them from their possession of the Jewish land, he's stuffing them into these unclean animals, and he's drowning them in the Sea of Galilee. And of course, when you hear about soldiers and military things and people drowning, if you're a Jew, you think of the Exodus. And you think of Pharaoh and his troops getting caught in the Sea of Galilee and God fighting for the Jews. This is a wonderful, layered story about the demonic and the apocalyptic, layered on top of Roman conquest, and this idea then that there are supernatural stakes at work then, when it comes to not only fighting over individual souls, but also the liberation of Israel itself. In Mark, the demons leave the man with a loud cry. The only other time you hear that phrase in Mark's gospel is when Jesus dies on the cross. That's his last words in Mark. He dies with a loud cry. The veil of the temple rips in two from top to bottom. The veil of the temple, remember, hides the presence of God in the Holy of Holies, so the ripping of the veil is literally an unveiling or an apocalypsis. And the Roman centurion who was in charge of the crucifixion at the foot of the cross says, when he sees the manner in which Jesus dies, screaming and saying that God has forsaken him, doesn't think that this man has had a collapse of faith, but counterintuitively thinks, surely this man was God's son. Now, he's a Roman centurion. The Son of God is Caesar, his boss. It says so on every Roman coin, Divi Filius. But he, a Roman soldier, an officer in the Roman army, which to an apocalypticist would be like a really high-ranking devil, sees the way in which Jesus dies with a loud cry, appreciates that apocalypse, and knows that Jesus is the true Son of God, not Caesar. So, I know we've gone over time, and I know your next service is beginning. I hope that's given you a couple of things to think about, as you encounter those stories of devils and demons in the Christian scriptures. Thank you very much.
Thank you.